Hi. It's so good to see you again. I hope you've been well. I know you've been busy lately, so I'm glad you stopped by. Have you had a good day today? I hope you have, but if it's been a bad day, don't worry. We all have those from time to time. But tomorrow is a new day and a fresh start. Do you have something that's bothering you? Tell me all about it. I'll be glad to listen. I know it's hard sometimes, but that's what friends are for, right? Friends are always there for you. I'm so glad that we're friends. Let me tell you a story about one of my other friends. Her name is Sarah. Sarah moved to a brand new city not too long ago, and she was very much looking forward to meeting new people and seeing new things. While she was still unpacking, she had a visitor. It was her new neighbor, a sweet older lady whose name was Miss Grace. Miss Grace wanted to officially welcome Sarah to the neighborhood, so she invited her over for dinner that night. Sarah gladly accepted, especially since all of her dishes and snacks were still in boxes. Miss Grace was delighted and left Sarah to finish unpacking while she went to prepare for dinner. When it was time for dinner, Sarah was starving because, as you know, moving is hard work and she had worked up quite an appetite. Miss Grace warmly welcomed Sarah into her home and asked her to help get dinner to the table. Sarah was happy to help and so glad to have made such a nice friend. Sarah very much enjoyed the wonderful dinner Miss Grace had prepared. She was such an amazing cook that after dinner she was very excited when Miss Grace offered her dessert. She could smell the delicious aroma of fresh baked apple pie coming from the kitchen, and she was more than happy to clear the table while Miss Grace removed it from the oven. Sarah thanked Miss Grace for her hospitality and graciousness for preparing such a marvelous meal and delightful dessert. She was even more excited as Miss Grace explained that her pie was kind of famous, at least around town, and it was for many years the winner of the town's dessert contest for the annual community festival. She pointed to the pictures on her wall that showed each year's dessert contest winners, which were all of her delicious apple pie, of course. Sarah's eyes barely left the lovely-looking pie as Miss Grace gently served a very generous piece onto each of their plates. Sarah's mouth was watering as she eagerly took the first bite. And as Miss Grace anxiously awaited her approval, Sarah's heart sank. This pie was unlike any she had tasted before. Sarah suddenly felt sick and hoped Miss Grace wouldn't be offended as she thanked her for dinner and asked to take her pie to go. After all, she needed to get home because it was getting late, and she had just remembered she needed to get up early the next morning for an appointment. Miss Grace understood and quickly packed up the remaining pie to send with Sarah to enjoy later. As Sarah carried the award-winning pie into her house, she couldn't stop thinking about Miss Grace. She felt so ashamed to rush out like that, but faced undoubtedly with the question of, how was the pie? She couldn't bear to answer. You see, when Sarah took a bite of that beautiful pie, she was shocked to taste nothing but salt. Surely there was a problem in her mouth that tricked her. She just couldn't believe that this beautiful, amazing-smelling, award-winning pie could be so, well, horrible. It was certainly inedible because each bite was more salty than the last. Sarah had no choice but to throw it out and hope Miss Grace would forget to ask her if she enjoyed it. Early the next morning, as Sarah was leaving her house, her next-door neighbor greeted her with, "Good morning, neighbor. I noticed you've been officially welcomed by Miss Grace. What a treat. Were you lucky enough to taste her pie? It's the best in town, you know. Have a great day. See you later." Sarah waved and just stood there in disbelief. Was this some sort of trick? Was there a hidden camera somewhere? Was this the same salty, horrible, inedible pie that we were talking about? As Sarah stood there thinking about her situation and wondering how such an awful pie could clearly be so loved, she didn't notice Miss Grace walking towards her. "Sarah, good morning, dear," she heard Miss Grace say before she even realized she was standing beside her. "Good morning. I do hope you enjoyed my pie. How was it?" Sarah swallowed hard. She had a choice to make. She could tell the truth and hope to not hurt the feelings of her sweet neighbor who had been so kind and gracious. Or she could tell a lie and keep her salty, horrible pie thoughts to herself. Before she knew it, Sarah was telling Miss Grace about how much she had enjoyed her pie, that it was amazing, the best pie she had ever eaten. She could completely understand how her pie won the contest every year, and that it was so wonderful she had eaten the whole thing last night in one sitting. For a moment, Sarah regretted saying those words and felt a knot growing in her stomach. She even thought Miss Grace looked slightly disappointed for a moment, until she turned to head home and said, "Well, in that case, I must make you another one to enjoy tonight." Before Sarah could protest, Miss Grace was almost home, and Sarah felt terrible. That evening, as Sarah was unpacking, she heard a knock at the door. It was Miss Grace, standing there proudly with another beautiful, fresh from the oven apple pie. Sarah welcomed her in and thanked her for the dessert. Miss Grace gently handed her the pie, apologized that she couldn't stay, and said that she hoped she enjoyed this pie just as much as the first. Sarah thanked her again and waved as she left, hoping this pie would taste better. As she placed a piece of warm, gooey apple pie on her plate, she was sure this pie was better. The smell alone was divine, and it looked mouth-watering. But, just as before, the first bite was so salty that Sarah couldn't eat it. Once again, she couldn't understand how something that looked and smelled so good could taste so bad. She felt terrible as she threw away the picture-perfect looking pie, but it was just too salty to eat. Over the next few days, Sarah went out of her way to avoid Miss Grace, so she wouldn't have to lie about her pie again. But being neighbors, it was only a few days before she saw Miss Grace walking by. When she asked about her pie, Sarah once again thanked her and at length talked about how good it was and how much she enjoyed it, even though her stomach turned with each word. The next afternoon, Miss Grace showed up again with a delicious-smelling apple pie, much to Sarah's dismay. Sarah again thanked her, but she later discovered that this pie was even more salty than the ones before and had to be thrown out also. And so this continued for many weeks, with many more salty pies, until the fall, when the dessert contest at the town's annual festival took place. Sarah was excited to attend her first small-town festival and was honored when she was asked to be a judge for the dessert competition this year. The festival was a delightful place, and Sarah enjoyed herself immensely until it was time for the dessert contest. Being a judge, she walked among the desserts to observe them with the other judges. There were so many cakes, cookies, pastries, and gorgeous pies that the whole tent smelled like a bakery. How in the world would she be able to decide which one was the best? And then, as the judges slowly walked by the last row of tables, Sarah's heart stopped. She stared, terrified, at the entry for Miss Grace's amazing apple pie, winner 10 years in a row. Oh no, Sarah thought. How crushed Miss Grace would be when the judges tasted her pie, and her stomach turned at the thought of the extremely salty pie. As the judges began sampling the various desserts for the contest, Sarah could barely contain her delight. Each of the amazing desserts placed before her seemed better than any dessert she had tasted in her entire life. It truly would be hard to pick a winner. Then the time came for a sample of Miss Grace's apple pie, and Sarah's hand trembled as she gently lifted a piece to her mouth. She tried to prepare her face so as not to reveal her detest of the salty displeasure sure to come, and she anxiously watched the faces of the other judges and that of Miss Grace, who stood in the crowd, awaiting the results of this year's contest. Although Sarah tried, nothing could have prepared her for what came next. As she slowly took a very small bite of salty pie, she was so astounded that she almost fell out of her chair. First one, and then another, until every bite of her sample was gone. And the judges were in agreement. This was by far the best, most savory, delicious, delectable pie they had ever tasted. Some even said it was more enjoyable than last year's pie. Surely Miss Grace's apple pie would win the contest again this year. As the judges talked together, Sarah sat confused and concerned. She just couldn't understand. This pie that was by all appearances the same salty, terrible, inedible pie Miss Grace had baked for her for months now, could not be the same pie she had tasted today. Something was terribly wrong. Had Miss Grace cheated somehow? Maybe she used someone else's pie, or perhaps she bought it from a bakery a few towns over. No, this couldn't be. Miss Grace was a very well-loved, appreciated, reputable, honest, beloved member of the town. There was no way she would have cheated. But then, how? Sarah had so many questions, but there was no time to consider them all. The time had come for the judges to make their decision. This year's winner would again be Miss Grace's apple pie, as it was clearly the best dessert among the tables. As Sarah hugged Miss Grace and posed for a picture with the winner and winning pie, Miss Grace leaned in close and whispered, "I'm so glad you enjoyed my pie." Sarah could feel her stomach knot up. She felt like she would faint. After all these months of terrible, salty pies and terrible little lies, she just couldn't stand it anymore. That night, as she approached Miss Grace's door, she wasn't sure what to say. She didn't want to seem rude or ungrateful for all the generous pies that Miss Grace had offered her, but she just couldn't understand and needed to know the truth about her contest-winning pie. Before she even knocked, the door opened and Miss Grace invited her in. After yet another wonderful dinner and very tense small talk, the attention turned to dessert, and Sarah knew she could not wait any longer. Sarah watched Miss Grace's face as she tried carefully to explain why she was so perplexed with her pie. As amazing and wonderful as it was at the festival, it was very sad to say that she didn't know how it was possible for Miss Grace to make such a wonderfully enjoyable pie. Miss Grace smiled softly. She explained that it was simple, really. She made the same recipe every year, but she always made sure to use the exact same type of apples as to preserve the sweetness of the pie. Sarah didn't know how to respond, and seeing her confusion, Miss Grace asked her a simple question. "Why did you enjoy this pie so much more than my other pies?" Sarah froze. The time had finally come. She couldn't lie anymore. Miss Grace listened intently as Sarah explained that from the beginning, the very first pie that she had been given after her wonderful welcome dinner was very different from the pie she had tasted at the annual dessert contest. Sarah told her as gently as she could that although the sight and smell of the pie was absolutely delightful, There was just no way the pies could be eaten. Every week, every pie that Miss Grace had given her was more salty than the last, and she was forced to throw them out one by one. Miss Grace nodded her head, smiled softly at Sarah, and said, "I know, dear." Sarah was so confused. She couldn't understand. "You know?" she asked. "What do you mean, you know? I don't understand." Miss Grace, so very sweet as ever, explained that honesty was a very important trait for a person to possess, as it's a great judge of a person's character. And so, as with any new friend or neighbor, she would always replace the sugar in her pie with salt to find out if that person was truly honest. "Sarah, my dear, I had hoped that after tasting my award-winning pie after dinner that first night, that you might be honest enough to at least ask me why it was so salty. Instead, you chose to ignore the truth and boast about how marvelous it was, much to my disappointment. And every time I brought you a pie, I was giving you another chance to be honest and tell me the truth, instead of lying to me and telling me what you thought I wanted to hear. I didn't want to keep bringing you those terrible pies. I wanted you to enjoy tasting the best pie in the town. But every time you chose not to be honest, I felt I should give you another chance to tell the truth." As Sarah heard these words, tears filled her eyes. She had wanted to be honest, and she certainly didn't intend to lie. But she realized then that she had been too scared to tell the truth. She apologized more than once to Miss Grace and thanked her for her honesty, kindness, and graciousness. She thanked her for being patient and for giving her so many chances to right her wrongs. She was so embarrassed that she had lied and didn't care enough to be honest, and she asked Miss Grace if she could ever forgive her. Sarah promised to be honest and to not lie again, and then she thanked Miss Grace for teaching her such a valuable lesson. From that day on, Miss Grace and Sarah were the best of friends and enjoyed many amazing pies together. Sarah learned just how important it is to always tell the truth. Otherwise, you might miss out on the most wonderful, amazing, award-winning things in life. My friend Sarah sure learned a valuable lesson. Maybe we can learn something from her and not make the same mistakes that she did. It is important to always tell the truth, even if it's scary or hard. Have you ever had to decide to tell the truth or to tell a lie? Sometimes it feels like we don't have a choice, doesn't it? Or maybe, like my friend Sarah, we might want to lie so we don't hurt someone's feelings or maybe even make them angry. Even though my friend Sarah was trying to be nice and not make Miss Grace feel bad, did she help herself or even help Miss Grace by telling a lie? Remember how Sarah felt sick and didn't want to see Miss Grace because she had lied to her? She knew that it was wrong, and it made her sad, and it hurt their friendship. Thankfully, Miss Grace understood and gave her a second chance to tell the truth. Poor Sarah, she missed so many good pies because she didn't tell the truth. Have you ever told a lie? How did it make you feel? Did you get a chance to make it right? You know, it's never too late to tell the truth. I promise it will make you feel so much better. Remember that being honest and always telling the truth is very, very important. I hope the next time you feel stuck and have to decide if you should tell the truth or tell a lie, that you remember my friend Sarah. Being honest and telling the truth is always the best choice. Thank you so much for stopping by today and listening to my story about Sarah and Miss Grace. Goodbye for now. I'll see you next time.